Good afternoon, everyone. This is Russ Harrison, Director of Government Relations for IEEE-USA in Washington, D.C. This is our July 8th, we're already into July 8th legislative update coming from Washington, D.C. Congress has not technically returned yet. They'll be returning on Monday after the 4th of July break. But July is usually a pretty high-pressured month. Congress knows it has to get most of the legislation that isn't the budget done by the end of the month, or not done, but at least pretty close to being done by the end of the month if they're going to get it done before the end of the year, because September becomes budget season and then you're into October and the holidays are just around the corner. So Congress has a lot of things on its plate, a lot of things to get done, and not an enormous amount of time to do it. So let's get into it. First of all, a little history update. Today is the anniversary of the first Hot Fudge Sundae, very important date in human history. Ed Berners in Two Rivers, Wisconsin, created the sundae on this date in 1880. There was a little dispute about this. There's a group in Ithaca, New York that say they invented the Hot Fudge Sundae before this. A study was done, commissioned by a professor at the University of Wisconsin, but I'm sure that in no way affected the integrity of the results. They concluded that Mr. Berners gets credit for the first Hot Fudge Sundae. Perhaps a little bit more momentous date. This is the anniversary of the last flight of the space shuttle. The space shuttle Atlantis went up on July 8th and represented the end of the American space shuttle program. Perhaps, cross our fingers, it's a timely reminder of that as the United States gets ready to go back into space in a major way. We've, of course, been going into space constantly over the last 10 years. But with SpaceX and a number of other new tools coming online, I expect the next 10 years in space to be a lot more exciting than the previous 10 years. So here in Washington, the big news over the last couple of weeks was the infrastructure bill. A deal was struck between Republicans and Democrats and the administration in the Senate for a infrastructure bill. The deal was struck, then it was unstruck, and it appears to be restruck now. The deal is basically $600 billion in new infrastructure spending and no tax increases, although that may change. The preliminary draft of the plan is $312 billion for transportation. That's roads and bridges predominantly, so kind of traditional infrastructure projects. $15 billion for electric vehicle infrastructure, $73 billion for power infrastructure, which is very important. That will be in building resilience into our electric grid, as well as investing in some alternative energy sources. And $65 billion for broadband expansion, which is a pretty decent investment. Now, this is the preliminary draft. 21 senators apparently have signed off on this, but this isn't really a plan yet. It's an outline of a plan, and there's a lot of details that need to be worked out and a lot of things that need to be argued about. And of course, 21 senators is not a majority of anything, so there's going to have to be negotiation with other folks as well. So we have a plan, sort of, at this point, but at least an outline of one is much better than nothing. Senator Schumer, the Senate Majority Leader's tentative strategy here is to bring this to the Senate floor mid to end of July, with a goal of having it passed by the Senate before they break for their August recess. That is a very ambitious plan for something that's not on paper yet, but Congress has been working on this bill for about 5 years now, so it's not like they're starting from scratch. And the odds of us getting some infrastructure bill passed before, well, passed by the Senate, then it goes to the House, but done this year are certainly much better now than they were last month. Last note on this, all the numbers on this slide are extraordinarily tentative. The absolute number is probably going to go up before this bill actually becomes law, as will most of the little line items in it. The other big news was the Kaseya hack. This was a giant cyber attack, hit over 1,000 businesses in 17 countries in the last week or so. And I think there's a couple things about this particular hack, beyond just the size of the thing, that are important. First of all, President Biden has called this ransomware attack, or ransomware attacks in general, a national security threat. Now, that seems fairly obvious, but using the language that President Biden used kind of triggers some legal solutions. It puts legal tools at the president's disposal to start responding to ransomware in a more aggressive way. Now, those tools were designed for other things, so it's not clear they're going to work for cyber attacks, but it does suggest that the administration is getting ready to be much more aggressive and much more proactive in doing something about this. The problem with the national security threat language is that it deals with this problem in a confrontational way, because you deal with national security threats by hitting back, basically. And that may be one way to deal with a cyber attack, and there are plenty of IEEE members that think we should do that, but it's not a legal thing anymore. In other words, you don't arrest national security threats, typically. You hit back at them. And so this suggests a course of action from the administration that will rely less on law enforcement and more on other tools at the government's disposal for dealing with ransomware attacks. The other interesting thing about this attack, important thing, is that it exploited a vulnerability in software managed service providers. These are companies that provide IT services to other companies, typically remotely. The importance of this is that this managed service providers, that model, is heavily used by small and mid-sized companies, companies that can't afford to have their own IT staff, and so they outsource it. This is also frequently the cause of why companies use H-1B visas, but it's also how small and mid-sized companies protect their cyber infrastructure. If this business model is now uniquely susceptible to cyber attacks, and one attack doesn't prove that, but it does suggest that even small and mid-sized companies are going to need some sort of in-house cyber defense, which is a problem because the United States doesn't have enough people to do that. You remember a couple months ago, there was a cyber attack against a water treatment plant in Florida. As I said then, that kind of got the attention of municipalities all over the country to tell them we're going to need to have some cyber experts on staff or on call to protect our infrastructure. This particular attack got the attention of a lot of smaller businesses and haven't been the target of cyber attacks in the past to say they're now coming after us too. We're going to need to hire some people to do something about this. It's not clear there are enough people to actually do that in the United States at the moment. On a related, although not necessarily connected front, there are a number of state cybersecurity laws that are going into effect either in the last couple months or the next couple months. Texas has a pretty aggressive bill that says that the state, if its cyber systems are compromised, must post information on that within 30 days so the public can see it. Companies have to report breaches of their systems to the government within 60 days. What's interesting about Texas is all of this is made public, so the public knows who's been hacked and who hasn't. If a company is hacked and then goes 1 year without a second hack, the report comes off the internet. And so the public no longer knows about it. It's an interesting and I think innovative way of using PR to push companies to beef up their cyber defenses. Rather innovative approach, I think. Tennessee has a similar bill that's going into effect. Companies must report breaches to the government, although it doesn't necessarily get made public. And companies need a plan for dealing with cyber threats. Connecticut took a different approach. Connecticut gave companies liability protection from breaches. So if your bank is hacked and you lose all your money, you can't sue the bank if they have adhered to one of a set of industry standards for cybersecurity. So basically, if you reach one of these levels in terms of providing cybersecurity, if you're hacked, you can't be sued. But you do have to tell your customers that they were hacked, but again, it's not made public. Colorado has a related, it's not really a cybersecurity law, it's a data privacy law, but I thought I'd mention it anyway. Colorado is giving citizens the right to opt out of the sale of personal data. Not nearly as expansive as the California laws, but fairly similar to the Virginia law that passed earlier this year. The Colorado law, last I checked, which was this morning, has not been signed into law by the governor of Colorado yet. He has till the end of today to either sign it or veto it. If he doesn't do either, it will become law. And all reports are that it will become law one way or another, but I'll just point out that it isn't technically law yet. A couple developments in the war on big tech. I reported last time that Florida has passed a fairly ambitious law to attack big tech. And among other things, it prohibited social media platforms from banning politicians' posts, tweets, or whatever else they're posting online. That law, not too surprisingly, has been shot down in court as a violation of the First Amendment. It is likely the state will appeal that decision. I said it was likely, it was predictable this bill was shot down because it is so innovative, and it does quite clearly bump right into the First Amendment. And typically, lower courts don't like making law when it's clearly a constitutional matter. They leave that for the appellate and the Supreme Court to deal with. So at the moment, the Florida law cannot go into effect, but they're likely to try to revise it down the line or revive it down the line. From outside the United States, India has passed a law earlier this year and now put it into practice, removing liability protection from Twitter. What the bill says is previously, like the United States, India had a law that said internet service providers, companies that provide platforms for people to talk online, were not liable for what people said. So if somebody issued a death threat on Twitter, you could try to punish the guy who issued the threat, but you couldn't go after Twitter for allowing it on their platform. India removed that. What India did is they said, in order to get liability protection, companies had to do a series of things, including appoint a chief compliance officer, appoint a resident grievance officer, have some procedures in place for removing offensive tweets. And most of the social media companies did that, at least in India. And Twitter didn't. And so a court in India has ruled that Twitter is no longer shielded from liability for anything that appears on its site in India. That includes having executives charged and tried in criminal court for posts made on Twitter. A little interesting that Twitter didn't do what it needed to do to maintain its protection, but it didn't. Google has now been sued by 36 states for anti-competitive practices. Basically, it's being charged with doing things to encourage or strong-arm companies to use its app marketplace for selling apps online. What's interesting is that it is 36 states. That's Republican states, Democratic states, red, blue, and everything else from all across the country. The lawsuit is being led by New York, Tennessee, and a couple others, although it was filed in California. Apparently, that's the easiest court to get these things done in. In the House, we mentioned this last time, there's a couple bills moving that target big tech, focusing particularly on monopolistic and anti-competitive behavior. H.R. 3825, the Ending Platform Monopolies Act, has bipartisan support in the House Judiciary Committee and is likely to make it, has a reasonably good chance of making it out of the House, less likely in the Senate, but at least the House. And just yesterday, the Republicans released their tech reform plan. It's interesting, it goes beyond just anti-competitive practices to include things like the Florida law, making sure everybody gets access to social media and other online services. That is unlikely to move in the House, but it shows you where the Republicans are. And it also shows us that both the Republicans and Democrats are now actively trying to rein in big tech in ways that may or may not be helpful overall. A little intellectual property issue that IEEE-USA is weighing in on. The Biden administration expressed support earlier this week for the TRIPS waiver. TRIPS stands for Trade-Related Aspects of Intellectual Property Rights, which doesn't actually spell TRIPS, but whatever. The TRIPS waiver would remove intellectual property protections for COVID vaccines. Basically, it would allow anybody to produce COVID vaccines anywhere in the world. The theory being that the world needs these vaccines more quickly, so we shouldn't just allow a couple companies to produce them and a couple companies to profit from them. The exact TRIPS waiver is being negotiated in the WTO, which has authority over these sorts of things. IEEE-USA has expressed opposition to the TRIPS waiver. Our thinking is this. First of all, we do recognize that COVID is an extraordinary case, both because of the seriousness of the situation and because the COVID vaccines were paid for with taxpayer money in large amount. And therefore, there's a certain logic to saying, well, if the American taxpayers paid for this, then they should become public property. The problem is the TRIPS waiver being debated in the WTO is much broader than just the vaccines. It includes technology, equipment, treatments, diagnostic material, and equipment associated with the COVID disease. We are concerned about the precedent that would set and the implications for innovation in the next pandemic. IP remains a cornerstone of innovation. The reason the United States and the rest of the Western world is so innovative relative to the rest of the globe is in large part because people get the right to what they invent. And if they invent something very cool, they can make humongous amounts of money off of it, which is a good thing because that's why people work so hard to invent vaccines and diagnostic equipment and all the other cool things that IEEE members invent every year. So COVID is, like I said, kind of an exceptional case. You can understand the justification for it. However, it's worth noting a number of legislators in Congress have already called for other medicines and other medical things to lose its intellectual property protection, so it would become much cheaper, which we are concerned would have a harmful impact on medical innovation and could over time spread to more and more things, undermining intellectual property protection as a property right, which would be, we think, very harmful. So Congress is in the middle of budget season. It started a little late this year, but there's been some progress. The following appropriations bills have passed out of the House Appropriations Committee: Ag, Financial Services, the Interior Environment, Legislative Branch. Congress always pays for itself first. Military Construction, and State and Foreign Operations. You will note that none of those appropriations bills are the ones we care about, really. The science, the DoD, the DOE are still being worked on. But, 6 is a good start, and they're off and running. All of the votes were more or less on party lines, some a little more, some a little less. But they were roughly, Republicans opposed most of them and Democrats supported most of them, almost in unison. The Senate has not moved anything out of committee yet. That's not too surprising. The Senate, as we've discussed, always comes second. And so it takes them a little longer. But they are probably about 2 months behind schedule at this point, which again points to an omnibus bill at the end of the year. Talked about the NSF Reauthorization bill a couple times. This is the House alternative to the Endless Frontier Act. Technically, it's called the NSF for the Future Act, but it reauthorizes NSF for another 5 years. That is, it gives the NSF the legal right to exist for another 5 years. But it is similar in some ways. It has some differences, but it's similar to the Endless Frontier Act. Most importantly, perhaps, is it creates a Directorate of Science and Engineering Solutions, which is similar to the Engineering Directorate, the Innovation Directorate, created in the Endless Frontier Act. So this would be a piece of the National Science Foundation focused directly on high-profile and high-priority research, which includes most of the things that IEEE does: AI, quantum, robotics, all the cool stuff that IEEE members are involved in. This was a key ask of IEEE-USA and something that we got a lot of pushback on because some other groups and some other people didn't want to segregate high-profile, highly promising research in its own directorate, but now the House and the Senate both have bills that do that, although they do it a little differently. The basic numbers in the NSF Reauthorization bill: $77.9 billion from NSF over 5 years. Endless Frontier Act had 52, but Endless Frontier has a couple other pots of money that NSF can get a hold of, including the directorates, which we'll talk about in a second. So, they're more or less the same, not exactly, but close. Same thing with the directorates. The House gives it 13 billion. The Senate gave it 29 billion. Differences, but not enormous. The Senate bill's directorate has some things in it that this House bill doesn't. So the numbers aren't quite as unequal as they appear there. What's important about the House bill is what it doesn't include. It doesn't include anything in the Department of Energy. It doesn't include the CHIPS Act for semiconductor manufacturing, and it doesn't include regional technology hubs. Now, the House has said, and they're moving to do this, that they are going to move those bills separately, and then everything can be put together when the bills are conferenced between the House and the Senate. That also includes the NASA reauthorization bill, which passed last week, which is part of Endless Frontier in the Senate. So we are expecting a number of other bills, like the CHIPS Act, over the next couple weeks, hopefully before August, so the bills can be conferenced over the August recess, and they can come back in September and get this thing done. But there is a lot of work to do there. The other thing that we find a little troubling about the NSF reauthorization bill, the NSF for the Future Act, is that there's a lot of money in the bill, as there is in the Endless Frontier Act, for workforce development, either for students, for workforce training, for community colleges. The problem is the House bill concentrates those resources heavily at the university level, particularly at the graduate and postgraduate level. So there's a lot of money for research assistants, for postdocs, for scholarships for graduate students, not very much for the non-college track. And we think that's kind of a lost opportunity. And it's kind of a missing piece because the United States clearly needs more educated PhD AI experts and quantum experts and physicists and all the other folks. But we also need people who just know how to build things. And this is one of the points we're making on the Hill, particularly in regard to cybersecurity. As I mentioned earlier, the United States doesn't have enough cybersecurity experts to secure every municipality, every piece of our infrastructure, and every small and mid-sized, as well as large, business in this country. We just don't have enough people. So we need to train more cyber experts, which we can do. Some of those folks should go to college and get degrees in computer science or cyber security or whatever they want to get their degree in. But not everybody has to do that. People with just specialized training, certificate programs, professional training, on-site training in companies, kind of internships and those sort of jobs, you can do a lot of good in the cyberspace. You're probably not going to come up with the next great piece of cybersecurity technology, but if somebody else comes up with that technology, you can implement it for your business. So we think the fact that the NSF for the Future Act focuses education dollars so much, there is some money for undergraduate and a little bit for technical training. But because it concentrates that money so heavily at the upper end of the education scale, we think that's a little unbalanced. And Congress needs to invest more money lower down or in other pieces of the education system. The NSF for the Future Act did pass the House. It passed on June 28th by a vote of 345 to 63. Now, you recall the Endless Frontier Act just barely passed the Senate with the 60 votes, I think it was 63 votes, it needed to pass. And the vote was fairly partisan. As you can see, this one wasn't. It was passed overwhelmingly by both parties, and that strengthens the House's hand in negotiations with the Senate whenever it is that they take place. A couple interesting hearings. These have all already happened, so you can watch them at the links that are on the screen. Although rather than typing the links, I recommend you just Google the name of the hearing or the name of the committee. They're all posted there. Aviation infrastructure for the 21st century, looking at airports and other aviation infrastructure projects, which will be part of the infrastructure bill. Safe wireless future, securing our networks and supply chains. Excuse me. Something that we care greatly about. And then a more general hearing on infrastructure needs. Again, it coming from the Energy Committee, so focusing on energy infrastructure, which is a useful thing for Congress to focus on. Again, IEEE-USA wants a broader definition of infrastructure than just roads and bridges, and our power infrastructure should be part of that. It looks like it's going to be. Next update will be in 2 weeks, Thursday, July 22nd. July will be just about over there. They'll be in their final sprint before the August recess. It should be absolute chaos on Capitol Hill, which is always fun and entertaining. If you have any questions about anything I covered, please put them in the chat field on your computer. I will turn to that in just a moment, but before I do, remind you, my name is Russell Harrison. I'm the Director of Government Relations for IEEE-USA in Washington, D.C. My phone number is 202-530-8326. My email address is r.t.harrison@ieee.org. If you ever have any questions about what IEEE is doing on policy, what IEEE-USA is doing in Washington, D.C., or what the U.S. government is doing to engineers in your piece of the world, please feel to reach out and ask. And with that, I'm going to stop sharing my screen and turn to comments. There we go. Let's see, power infrastructure typically is a private company responsibility. Where would the federal money go? Yeah, that's a tricky question. It's private company responsibility, but it's utilities, which are technically private companies, but it's a kind of a gray area there. But the money we don't have the bills yet. They haven't written them, so I can't tell you definitively where the money's going to go because they haven't decided yet. But it mostly go into building resilience into the electrical grid. More high voltage power lines, more power sources. There'll probably be investments in alternative energy, solar and wind in particular. But the goal there would be to make the electric grid more resilient. And some of that money will simply be given to the utilities with an expectation that they spend it in particular ways. Since utilities are private companies, but they're heavily regulated, that's easier than with most private companies. Oh, yes. Thank you, Brendan, for reminding me about that. Legislation recently introduced to increase the cyber workforce. The expectation is that if that bill passes, it will pass one of two ways. It will either be added to the NDAA, the National Defense Authorization Act, which has to pass at the end of the year, or it will be added to the Endless Frontier Act or whatever it becomes after it comes out of conference. There is language on the cyber workforce in the Endless Frontier Act. Cornyn's bill will broaden that and expand the workforce programs. I suspect Senator Cornyn introduced that specifically to act as a counterbalance to the House, which has language on the cyber workforce, but it's just the master's and PhD level, which is good. I mean, we obviously need to support people getting master's and PhDs in cyber, but we need to support other people as well. So the prognosis that we get some program to expand the cyber workforce is very good. It will not be Cornyn's bill, but it may be something similar to that added to another bill. And I do not see any other questions. Okay. If something comes to you in the next couple days, by all means, reach out. Russ Harrison, r.t.harrison@ieee.org. Hope you have a great July, and we will talk to you again on the 22nd. Thank you for joining me today.
My superpower is engineering. I've been a roboticist almost all my life now. I think engineering is just as creative as the arts. Engineers, we solve problems. It impacts the world. It makes a difference. Without IEEE, I don't think I would have the network that I have. Anyone can get involved with IEEE-USA at any time. There's an immense amount of value for anyone at any career stage.